Old Town is a place where time seems to have stopped. It is a forgotten district where the architecture screams of the 18th century and the fog never truly lifts. It clings to the cobblestones like a heavy grey shroud, turning every street corner into a hazy mystery. The air here smells of damp earth and ancient stone, reminding those who visit that they are walking through a living mausoleum. Elias drove through the narrow gates with deep-seated cynicism. As an investigative journalist, he dealt in facts and the harsh light of reality. He had spent his career exposing frauds, yet here he was, returning to his ancestral home after the sudden death of his father. The official report called it an accident, a simple fall, but Elias knew better. His father was a man who measured every step with precision. There was nothing accidental about his silence. The house was a towering structure of dark wood and stained glass that looked as though it were leaning over the street, watching everyone below. Elias spent his first nights clearing out clutter, but eventually found a false panel behind the library bookshelf. Behind it lay a hidden study, a room untouched by the dust that covered the rest of the house. The walls were lined with forbidden texts, with leather covers cracked with age. On the desk sat a collection of weapons lined with pure silver, their blades gleaming with a lethal light. Next to them were several hand-drawn maps of the town's sewer system, marked with strange symbols and red ink that looked uncomfortably fresh. Elias felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hallways. As he climbed to the attic, a sudden, unnatural cold swept through the room. The temperature dropped so sharply that his breath turned into a white mist. The windows frosted over in seconds. Elias turned toward the glass, and for one terrifying heartbeat, he saw a reflection that was not his own. A woman stood directly behind him, her face pale and her eyes filled with ancient sorrow. He spun around, but the room was completely empty. The next afternoon, Elias met Julian at a dimly lit café. Julian was a local historian with a charming smile and eyes that held centuries of secrets. He spoke about the founding families with a reverence that made Elias uneasy. Julian leaned across the table, warning Elias that some families in this town have blood that runs colder than the winter itself. He suggested that Elias should stop digging before he found something that did not want to be disturbed. Later that evening, Elias found his father's journal in the study. The final entry was dated the night of his death. The handwriting was frantic. It mentioned 3 figures known only as the unaging 3. The entry ended with a chilling sentence. It stated that a debt had been called in, a debt that must be paid in red. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Restless, Elias walked through the district at dusk. The fog was thicker than usual, turning street lamps into dull blurs. Near a narrow alleyway, he heard a muffled cry. He saw a local beggar being suddenly hoisted off the ground. A figure, moving with impossible blurred speed, dragged the man into the darkness. Elias ran to help, but by the time he reached the spot, there was only a lonely discarded hat and a single drop of blood. Elias returned home and tore through old boxes of photographs. He found a sepia-toned image from the year 1890. His heart skipped a beat. Standing on the far left was Julian. He looked exactly the same as he had that afternoon at the café. In the photograph, Julian stood next to a massive pile of charred remains, his hand resting casually on a cane. The history of Old Town was still walking the ancient and dark streets. Elias did not wait for the sun to rise before seeking out Julian. He found him at a private gala, held at Blackwood Manor, an estate where the air felt like a stagnant tomb. The guests moved with a forced grace, their laughter sounding like dry leaves skittering across a graveyard. When Elias showed the photograph from 1890, Julian merely smiled with eyes that had seen 1,000 winters. Julian explained that the elite of Old Town were a refined coven of vampires who had steered the town's politics for centuries. The town was their garden, and the citizens were merely the crop they harvested whenever the hunger grew too great to ignore. The revelation grew darker when Julian told Elias that his ancestors were not innocent victims. For generations, the family of Elias had served as the keepers. It was their solemn duty to manage the logistics of the coven, ensuring their secrets remained buried in exchange for wealth and influence. Elias felt a wave of cold nausea settle in his stomach. His father had not been a simple scholar. He was the man who kept the monsters hidden from the light of the world. Julian revealed that the death of his father was a direct result of a change of heart. After decades of service, the old man tried to break the generational contract. He chose a lonely death over continuing the legacy of complicity. As Elias returned home, the weight of this legacy felt like a physical burden. The hauntings intensified as the ghosts of the harvested began to manifest in the hallways. These were the souls sacrificed to feed the coven's eternal life. They appeared in every shadow, their translucent forms flickering like dying candles in a draught. They did not attack Elias, but reached out with silent, hollow pleas for a release they could not find. The temperature in the study dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and the walls seemed to weep, a dark, viscous fluid. Elias realized the spirits were tethered to the house because of his family's active role in their gruesome deaths. Desperate for an ally, Elias sought out Sarah, the local librarian. She was the only person who seemed to treat him with genuine kindness in this district. However, while they worked together in the dim basement, Elias noticed a jagged scar on the back of her neck. It was the mark of a thrall, a human servant bound to the coven by blood. Sarah had not been helping him out of friendship. She had been feeding every detail of his movements back to Julian and the Unaging Three. Before he could react to this betrayal, the heavy basement doors slammed shut, and the lights flickered out into a suffocating darkness. Elias woke up in the freezing air of the catacombs deep beneath the Old Town Cathedral. The scent of copper was overwhelming, mixed with ancient dust and the smell of rot. He was not restrained, but the maze of tunnels made escape impossible. In a circular chamber, 3 figures stood perfectly still in the shadows. These were the Unaging Three, the ancient leaders of the coven whose influence reached back to the Middle Ages. Julian stood beside them, looking at Elias with a pitying smile. He explained that the coven had no desire to kill him. Investigative journalists were a nuisance, but a loyal keeper was a necessity. They offered him a choice: take his father's place as the gatekeeper, or face the same fate as the beggars in the alleys. To seal this new blood covenant, Julian dragged a sobbing Sarah into the center of the chamber. He handed Elias a silver dagger, the same weapon found in his father's secret study. Julian's voice was a whisper as he told Elias that loyalty required a sacrifice. To prove he was ready to embrace his dark heritage, Elias would have to perform his first harvest tonight. Sarah looked up with terror and soul-shattering regret, her breath hitching in the cold air. The silence of the catacombs was heavy, broken only by the sound of Elias's frantic heartbeat as the ancient shadows closed in from every side. Elias gripped the silver dagger, his knuckles white. The eyes of the Unaging Three were like cold marbles, watching his every move. He looked at Sarah, whose tears were the only warmth left in that frozen crypt. He knew he could not defeat 4 ancient predators with a single blade. He lowered his gaze, forcing his voice into a tone of feigned, resigned obedience. He told Julian that he would accept the burden of his father, but only if he was allowed to use the proper tools. He claimed his father had spoken of a sanctified kit kept in the cathedral vault, a collection of relics necessary to maintain the balance between the living and the dead. Julian, arrogant in his centuries of dominance, believed the hunger for power had finally won Elias over. He led the way toward the vault, a heavy iron-bound room tucked behind the main altar. Inside, Elias found a heavy oak box. He felt the weight of the history his father had tried so desperately to escape. Among the relics, Elias saw a small, blackened stone pulsating with a faint, sickly rhythm. This was the Old Town Heart, the cursed relic that anchored the coven to this physical realm and fueled the eternal fog. It felt hot to the touch, vibrating with a malevolent energy that made his teeth ache. Elias realized that killing the vampires one by one was impossible. He had to strike at the source of their immortality. As Julian stepped forward to take the kit, Elias snatched a heavy silver crucifix and smashed it against the glass casing of the relic. The sound echoed through the silent cathedral. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The ghosts of the harvested began to pour through the floorboards and the walls. They were no longer silent or pleading. They were a screaming hurricane of vengeance. They swirled around Elias, forming a translucent, shimmering wall of white light that kept the vampires at bay. Julian let out a hiss, his face twisting into a demonic mask. He lunged at the barrier, but the spectral hands of his former victims pushed him back. Sarah, seeing her moment of redemption, grabbed a discarded silver stake from the kit. She threw herself at Julian, not to kill him, but to pin him against a stone pillar. She knew her own life was forfeit the moment she turned on her masters. She screamed for Elias to finish the ritual, her voice cracking as Julian's claws tore into her shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient, rotting blood. Elias did not hesitate. He raised the heavy silver mallet from the kit and brought it down on the Old Town Heart. On the first strike, the stone cracked, and a sound like a dying god filled the chamber. On the second strike, the relic shattered into 1,000,000 black shards. A spiritual shockwave erupted from the altar, white and blinding. The vampires did not just die, they unraveled. Without the relic's protection, the weight of their stolen years crashed down upon them. Julian's skin turned to parchment, then to dust. His eyes blowing out like extinguished candles before his bones crumbled into a pile of grey ash. When the light finally faded, the catacombs were silent. Sarah lay still near the pillar, her eyes closed in a final sleep. Elias climbed the stairs out of the crypt and pushed open the heavy cathedral doors. For the first time in his life, the fog over Old Town was gone. The morning sun was rising over the horizon, painting the 18th century architecture in gold. The oppressive weight that had defined the district for centuries had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, quiet shell of a town. The citizens would wake up today feeling a lightness they had never known, unaware of the nightmare that had ended in the dark. Elias returned to his ancestral home only once. He gathered every book and every blood-stained journal and piled them in the center of the room. He struck a single match and watched as the legacy of the keepers turned to smoke. He drove across the bridge, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, vowing never to look back. But as the car sped into the countryside, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For one terrifying split second, two glowing, amber eyes stared back at him from the darkness of the back seat. The debt was not yet paid, and the shadows were not finished with him.